The sleek, silver aircraft gleamed under the warm afternoon sun, its polished exterior reflecting the promise of an extraordinary journey. Inside the cabin, opulence greeted every passenger. Plush leather seats lined the aisle, gold accents shimmered in the light, and the soft hum of ambient music set the tone for a luxurious experience. Passengers strolled confidently through the cabin, their expensive luggage rolling behind them, the air thick with an unspoken understanding that they were part of something exclusive, something extraordinary. Among these well-heeled travelers was Layla Andrews, a composed and dignified woman in her late 30s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer and matching slacks. Layla exuded a quiet elegance, her every movement smooth and measured. She was the epitome of understated grace, and despite the luxurious environment around her, she remained largely unnoticed by the other passengers. It wasn't her goal to draw attention, she had always preferred to let her presence speak for itself. Layla's seat, located near the front of the cabin, was the ideal place to settle in and relax. The flight wasn't just another trip, it was a crucial journey to oversee her growing empire. Although no one on board had any inkling of her true identity, Layla preferred to keep it that way. For now, she was simply a passenger, albeit one who held power in a world most of her fellow travelers could only dream of. The flight attendant, Angela, stood near the entrance, her sharp features and perfectly tailored uniform signaling control and authority. She greeted the passengers with a smile that was warm for some, colder for others. She prided herself on maintaining order and efficiency, but her sense of order often depended on the appearance and behavior of the passengers she served. Angela had mastered the art of judgment based on superficial assessments. In her mind, those who looked the part of high society deserved her respect. Others, like Layla, did not. As passengers settled into their seats, a couple in their 60s, John and Sarah Walters, made their way to their seats. They exuded the ease of seasoned travelers, Sarah already clutching her knitting bag, eager to begin her work, and John leisurely unfolding a newspaper. Angela's smile brightened considerably as she greeted them. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Walters." "Lovely to have you on board," Angela said warmly. Layla observed this exchange from her seat, noting the stark contrast in the flight attendant's demeanor. Angela's tone was noticeably different when it came to her. Layla's expression remained calm, though her sharp eyes reflected an awareness of the unspoken dynamics at play. She knew she was being judged by her appearance alone. Her quiet, unassuming nature didn't fit the mold of the high society passengers Angela believed deserved her respect. As the passengers settled in, Angela continued her rounds, checking on the Walters with an extra dose of warmth and attentiveness. When she reached Layla, however, her expression became colder, and without a word, Angela passed by, her eyes momentarily flicking toward Layla's bag resting neatly under the seat. Angela didn't offer the same courtesy to Layla as she had to the Walters. There was no smile, no warmth, only a quick, dismissive glance before she continued her rounds. Layla, ever the professional, let the slight pass without comment, but a quiet tension began to build inside her. It was subtle, but Layla knew something was off. Angela was in her early 40s, carrying herself with the precision of someone who thrived on control. Her immaculate uniform and perfectly coiffed hair only reinforced her sense of superiority. She had no patience for those who didn't fit the standards she had set in her mind. Layla's composed demeanor and understated elegance clearly didn't align with the expectations Angela held for the elite passengers. It was only a matter of time before Angela's judgmental tendencies came into play. Layla had become the target of her scrutiny. Angela approached her seat with quick, purposeful strides. Her lips curled into a tight smile as she addressed Layla. "Excuse me, Ma'am, Angela began, her voice polite but dripping with condescension, I think you're in the wrong section. Layla looked up at her, her gaze unwavering, her expression calm. She didn't react to the tone or the subtle insult. Instead, she responded simply, I believe this is my seat. Angela's smile didn't falter, but her voice tightened. I don't think so. This section is reserved for our elite passengers. As Angela spoke, nearby passengers began to notice the exchange. A nosy socialite, seated across the aisle, leaned forward ever so slightly to get a better view. She couldn't resist the temptation to eavesdrop, curiosity piqued by the subtle confrontation unfolding before her. A businessman, seated next to the socialite, glanced over, a frown settling on his face as he noticed Angela's tone with Layla. Layla, undeterred, remained composed, her steady gaze locked on Angela. She responded calmly, you might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions. Angela's eyebrows arched, and her irritation became palpable. I don't need to check anything, she said sharply. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. The tension in the cabin escalated, passengers exchanging furtive glances and murmuring among themselves. Some pretended not to notice, while others exchanged uncomfortable looks. One passenger muttered, why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat? Another shrugged, adding, she's probably just trying to sneak in for a free upgrade. Angela crossed her arms over her chest, her stance now rigid and unyielding. If you don't move to the back of the plane, I'll have to call security, she declared loudly enough for the other passengers to hear. Layla, still seated, tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining calm and collected. Call whoever you need to, she said, her tone even and unflinching. But I'm not moving. The nosy socialite gasped softly at the exchange, the businessman leaned forward, clearly concerned, his brow furrowed. Angela, now visibly frustrated, turned to a junior flight attendant, Grace, who had been watching the confrontation from a distance. Grace, Angela snapped, escort her to the back now. Grace hesitated, torn between doing what was right and obeying her superior. She glanced nervously between Layla and Angela, but the sharp glare from Angela froze her in place. Reluctantly, she nodded and took a step forward. Layla shifted in her seat slightly, her calm demeanor still intact. She gave Grace a soft, almost imperceptible warning, you might want to think carefully about what you're doing. Angela scoffed dismissively, waving off Layla's words. I know exactly what I'm doing, she retorted. Now, get up. Layla remained seated, unyielding in her calmness, her words carrying the weight of quiet defiance. She knew she was standing her ground, and though no one on the plane could have predicted what would happen next, Layla was prepared to let the situation unfold on her terms. The tension in the cabin thickened as Layla Andrews remained seated, her back straight, her eyes unwavering, while Angela's sharp gaze drilled into her. The atmosphere had shifted from quiet luxury to an undercurrent of discomfort. Passengers were beginning to notice the exchange, some watching with growing unease, while others pretended not to see, their attention turning to their phones or books. Yet, the murmur of whispered judgments only made the situation more charged. Angela stood by Layla's seat, her posture rigid with authority, arms crossed over her chest. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, a clear sign that she had no intention of backing down. I'm giving you one last chance, ma'am, Angela said, her tone clipped, dripping with condescension. Move to the back of the plane, or I'll have to call security. Her voice carried across the cabin, the words echoing in the still air, meant to force compliance. Layla's expression was calm, almost serene, As she looked up at the flight attendant, her gaze steady. "I've already told you, I'm not moving," she said softly, her voice firm and composed. It was as if Angela's words were little more than a passing breeze. She wasn't going to let herself be intimidated. The passengers around them had started to take notice, some looking up from their magazines or phones, drawn into the escalating confrontation. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others remained silent, unsure of how to respond. One woman in the back, dressed in an expensive-looking dress, whispered to her companion, "What's going on? Why is she still sitting there?" Meanwhile, a businessman sitting across the aisle from Layla frowned, his brows furrowing as he watched Angela's increasingly hostile demeanor. Angela's face reddened, her irritation growing with every passing second. She had been in control of the situation from the moment she entered the cabin, but now, with Layla's calm defiance, she found herself losing her grip on that power. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed as she looked at the calm, collected woman in front of her. She wasn't used to this. Passengers usually complied without question, especially in the presence of someone like Angela, who had mastered the art of maintaining control through intimidation and authority. "Listen, I don't have time for this," Angela said, her voice growing louder, though still dripping with that same condescending edge. "This section is for elite passengers, and you don't belong here. It's not that complicated." She gestured toward the rear of the plane, emphasizing her point. Layla didn't flinch. She didn't even react to the insulting undertone of Angela's words. Her posture remained as perfect as ever, as though the exchange was nothing more than a brief inconvenience. "You might want to double-check your passenger list," Layla said, her voice still calm and controlled. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Angela's eyes narrowed further. There was no way she was going to let this woman undermine her authority, especially in front of the other passengers. "I've already checked the list," she said with a huff. "You don't belong here, and I'm not going to argue with you about it." The passengers around them had grown increasingly uncomfortable. A few of them exchanged furtive glances, some pretending not to notice the tension, while others leaned forward slightly, clearly interested in the outcome of the situation. One woman in the back, who had been watching the exchange closely, whispered to her companion, "She's acting like she owns the place. It's ridiculous." As the confrontation escalated, Layla remained as unshaken as ever. She wasn't about to give in to Angela's pressure. She had spent her entire life learning how to navigate situations like this with grace and poise. Being underestimated was something she had become accustomed to. What Angela didn't realize was that Layla wasn't someone you pushed around. She wasn't someone who would be swayed by superficial judgments. She was a woman who had earned her place in the world. No one could take that from her. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point when Angela, now visibly frustrated, snapped her fingers at Grace, the junior flight attendant. "Grace, escort this woman to the back now," Angela ordered, her voice sharp. Grace hesitated, looking between Angela and Layla, unsure of what to do. She had been quietly observing the situation, but now, with Angela's command, she found herself caught in the middle. She could see the subtle shift in Layla's expression. There was something in her gaze that spoke volumes. But Grace was a junior flight attendant, and she had learned early on that it was best not to question authority. Still, something about this didn't sit right with her. Reluctantly, Grace stepped forward. Her hand hovered nervously near the passenger list clipped by the cockpit door. She was about to speak up, but Angela shot her a pointed glare, silencing her before she could utter a word. "I've got this under control," Angela muttered, her voice low but fierce. "You don't need to get involved." Grace nodded, her face flushed with discomfort. She stepped forward, her footsteps hesitant. As she approached Layla's seat, she felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. She wanted to speak up, to ask Angela to check the list again, to make sure there wasn't some sort of mistake. But Angela's commanding presence left her little room for questioning. She could feel the heat of the situation building, the cabin growing warmer with every passing second. Layla, however, didn't waver. She continued to sit calmly, her gaze unwavering. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her voice almost soothing, yet carrying an undeniable strength. The passengers around them were watching with bated breath, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. Angela's patience had worn thin. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper, "I don't know why you're making this harder than it needs to be. You're causing a scene." But Layla was unfazed. "I'm not the one making a scene," she said, her voice steady, almost gentle. "You are." Angela's face flushed with anger, and for the first time in the conversation, her composure faltered. The other passengers, who had been silent observers up until this point, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The unspoken energy in the cabin had changed. The mood had gone from casual luxury to palpable tension. And then, as if on cue, Layla spoke again, her voice unwavering. "You can try to push me around," Layla said calmly, "but I won't be moving. Not for you, not for anyone." Angela opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice rang out from across the aisle. "Excuse me," a businessman called, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything all right?" Layla turned toward him, offering a quiet nod, but Angela, seeing the support for Layla's side, snapped, "Everything's fine, sir. It's not your concern." The businessman, however, wasn't deterred. He glanced back at Layla, offering her a reassuring smile. "I don't think anyone here wants any trouble," he said gently, his eyes flicking between Angela and Layla. "Maybe we can all just take a moment to calm down." Layla smiled at him, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said. As the tension built and the conflict escalated, it became clear that this wasn't just about a seat on the plane, it was about something much bigger. Layla had made it clear that she wasn't going to back down, and Angela had made her intentions just as clear. But something deeper was at play in this moment, a clash of power, assumptions, and preconceived notions. And as the scene unfolded, it was impossible to ignore the undeniable truth. Something was about to change. The tension in the cabin had not dissipated. In fact, it only intensified as Naomi Williams, now fully aware of the shift in the dynamic around her, remained calm and composed in her seat. Angela's increasingly harsh tone and the uncomfortable murmurs from the surrounding passengers were not enough to rattle her. She had seen this before. She had felt the sting of prejudice and assumptions, but what Angela didn't understand was that Naomi was not someone who could easily be intimidated. As the minutes passed, Naomi sat still, her posture impeccable, her demeanor steady. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some sympathetic, some curious, and others uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. But none of them had yet realized the full gravity of the situation. They had no idea who Naomi was, what she represented, or how this seemingly small confrontation was about to change everything. Angela, however, was beginning to realize that she was losing control. Her initial confidence had begun to falter, and the passengers' eyes, which had once been fixed on their phones or books, were now on her. She could sense the shift, the way their attention had moved from the polite chatter of the flight to the escalating tension between herself and Naomi. A few passengers had even started whispering, exchanging glances, and it was clear that they were beginning to take sides. Angela walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She needed to regain control, to make sure this didn't spiral any further. Her thoughts were clouded with frustration. The audacity of this woman, how dare she challenge her authority in front of all these passengers? But as she approached Naomi once more, something inside her hesitated. She saw the way Naomi's calm presence seemed to radiate confidence, unshaken by the growing discomfort around her. Naomi's gaze met Angela's, but it wasn't one of defiance. It was steady, measured, and calm, something Angela hadn't expected. She had assumed this woman would be intimidated, but Naomi's stillness only made Angela feel smaller, less certain. The more she thought about it, the more Angela realized that she had no real reason to treat Naomi this way. Her assumptions, her judgments based on appearances and status, had led her down a path she was now struggling to navigate back from. Still, Angela wasn't ready to back down. She couldn't afford to lose face in front of the other passengers. Her voice cut through the cabin again, this time sharper than before. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said, her tone laden with authority. "Move to the back of the plane, or I'll be forced to call security." Naomi's voice was unruffled, her words as calm as ever. "I've already told you," she said, her tone soft but firm. "I'm not moving. And I'm not going to keep repeating myself." Angela's face flushed with frustration, but she pressed on, trying to force Naomi into submission. "You don't belong here. This is for elite passengers only," Angela said, her words almost dripping with disdain. She gestured toward the rear of the plane, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. Naomi didn't rise to the bait. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze. "You might want to check your list again," Naomi replied, her voice still calm. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The passengers were now watching the exchange closely. The murmur of voices had quieted down, and even the flight attendants in the back had stopped their tasks, subtly observing the scene. Naomi could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't let it rattle her. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, silence and composure were often the most powerful tools. Angela, however, was struggling. The longer Naomi refused to bend, the more desperate Angela became. She felt the eyes of the passengers on her, their judgment settling in the air around her. For the first time, Angela felt vulnerable. She had been the one in control, the one who held the power in this situation, but now, with Naomi's quiet defiance, she realized that she was losing. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. And the passengers, who had been so quiet and indifferent at the start, were now silently watching every move she made. Angela tried one last time. "I don't know why you're making this so difficult," she said, her voice rising. "This section is reserved for people like me, not people like you." The word stung, even though Naomi didn't show it. She had heard those kinds of comments before, but this time, there was something different in the way Angela said it. The venom in her words was unmistakable. Naomi's eyes locked with Angela's, and for the first time, her voice shifted, carrying more weight than before. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly, but with an undeniable strength. "And your assumptions are wrong." Angela flinched. Naomi's words landed like a punch, and for the first time, Angela realized just how deeply her prejudice had clouded her judgment. She wasn't dealing with just any passenger. She was dealing with someone who understood power, who had seen through the superficial judgments people made based on appearances. Angela's mind raced as she processed Naomi's words, but before she could respond, a voice from across the aisle interrupted her. "Is there a problem here?" a businessman asked, his voice calm and measured. Naomi turned to him, offering a small, appreciative smile. "No problem at all," she said, her voice steady. But Angela wasn't ready to let it go. She glanced at the businessman and then back at Naomi, her patience wearing thin. "I'm handling this," she snapped, her eyes flashing with irritation. The businessman didn't flinch. "From where I'm sitting," he said quietly, "it seems like you're the one causing the problem." Naomi's smile deepened slightly, though her gaze never wavered. The businessman's words were a subtle challenge to Angela's authority, and Angela, feeling her power slip away, could no longer maintain the front she had carefully constructed. Naomi remained seated, her calm demeanor now radiating an undeniable presence. The passengers were starting to notice her, really notice her, not just as a fellow traveler, but as someone who commanded respect. Angela crossed her arms and turned away, trying to regain some semblance of control. Her body language was defensive, but she was beginning to realize that no matter how much she tried to assert herself, she could not force Naomi to do anything. Naomi wasn't going to back down, and neither was she. And in that realization, something inside Angela shifted. She had been trying to dominate the situation, but now she was the one who felt small. Naomi, however, wasn't concerned with Angela's struggle for control. She had long learned the value of patience in moments like these. Sometimes, silence was louder than words. And today, her quiet confidence was about to be her most powerful weapon. The rest of the flight unfolded in an uneasy silence. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, their unease palpable in the air. Naomi, however, remained steady, her mind focused. Angela had underestimated her, and Naomi knew that the next phase of the confrontation was about to begin. But for now, she would let Angela's insecurity speak for itself. The tension between the two women hung in the air like an unspoken promise. Something was going to change. And Naomi, the woman who had been underestimated from the start, was going to make sure of it. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. Naomi's calm demeanor had remained unbroken, but the uneasy silence in the air spoke volumes. Angela, still visibly rattled by the businessman's subtle intervention, had moved away, but the sting of Naomi's words lingered. The flight attendants around the cabin were no longer their usual composed selves. The air of luxury, once present in every corner of the plane, now felt tainted with discomfort. Naomi knew it was only a matter of time before the situation would escalate further, but she was ready. As the plane continued its smooth flight, Naomi's mind raced with the events that had unfolded. She had already anticipated the prejudice that she would face in situations like this. It was not the first time her appearance had been questioned, nor would it be the last. But something about today felt different. The passive whispers, the glances exchanged between passengers, all seemed to confirm what Naomi had suspected. She wasn't just being judged for her looks, but for the way she carried herself, the confidence that seemed to shake the assumptions of those around her. Angela had made a grave misstep by underestimating her. The flight attendant's attempts to intimidate Naomi had failed not because Naomi was immune to fear, but because she had learned the importance of self-possession. Naomi had cultivated the skill of silence, and today, it was her greatest weapon. Yet she could feel the shift in the cabin. The way Angela's increasingly abrasive behavior had now turned into a moment of reckoning. Naomi could sense that Angela was still holding onto a thin thread of authority, but that thread was fraying quickly. As Naomi sat in her seat, quietly observing the changing dynamics, she could see the ripple effect of the encounter. Passengers who had initially been quiet spectators were now actively looking for answers. They shifted uncomfortably, glancing over at Naomi and exchanging hushed whispers. Some were likely wondering how this could have escalated to the point of tension. Others, however, began to see through the layers of pretense. They were no longer passive bystanders. Naomi knew she wasn't the only one paying attention. Everyone around her was processing the exchange in their own way. It wasn't long before Angela returned to Naomi's aisle. She moved with purpose, her earlier attempt at polite control now replaced by a more aggressive stance. She still had the tray in hand, but her polished composure had cracked. Naomi could see it in her eyes. Angela was fighting to maintain whatever shred of authority she believed she had. "Excuse me, ma'am," Angela said sharply, her voice taking on a clipped edge. "I'm going to have to insist you move to the back of the plane." Naomi looked up at her, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. Her gaze was steady, unfaltering, and Angela, despite her attempts to keep her cool, flinched under the weight of Naomi's stare. The passengers were beginning to sense the power dynamic shifting. The entire situation was starting to feel like a pressure cooker about to explode. "I'm not moving," Naomi said calmly. "I've told you that already, Angela. And you're making a mistake by pushing this further." Angela's lips twisted into a tight smile, but it was forced. She could feel her control slipping away, the frustration building in her chest. Naomi's words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any argument could. She wasn't responding in anger, she wasn't raising her voice, she was simply asserting her dignity. And in doing so, Naomi was setting the stage for something bigger. "Look, I've tried to be patient with you," Angela said, her tone now tinged with venom. "But you clearly don't understand your place here. This is a private jet for our elite passengers. You don't belong here, and frankly, I don't know why you're making a scene." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. "Making a scene," she echoed, her voice low and controlled. "You're the one making a scene, Angela. All I've done is sit here calmly, but you're the one escalating this." Angela's breath quickened as her frustration mounted. She was no longer speaking from a place of authority but from a place of insecurity. Naomi, despite being the subject of her scorn, was holding the power now. She was in control, and Angela's earlier attempts at intimidation had backfired. Naomi's presence, her calm, was an undeniable force that Angela couldn't seem to break. The passengers around them were now more attentive, sensing the shift in power. Some were starting to murmur quietly, their sympathy with Naomi becoming more evident. "I'm not going to ask you again," Angela snapped, her voice rising. "If you don't move to the back, I'll have to call security." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her calmness never wavering. "You can call whoever you want," she said softly. "But I'm not moving." The words hung in the air, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. It felt like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Naomi's composed response had shattered the illusion of control Angela had been clinging to. She wasn't afraid of Angela. She wasn't even angry. She was simply asserting her right to be treated with respect. And it was working. Angela's face flushed with embarrassment. She knew, deep down, that she had crossed a line. But she was determined to win this battle, to assert some kind of authority over Naomi. Her voice was quieter now, but still tinged with hostility. "You're making this difficult for everyone," she said, her words now lacking conviction. Naomi stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She was still composed, but there was a quiet power in the way she stood. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to back down either. "I'm not the one making this difficult," Naomi said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "You are. I've asked for nothing but the respect you should be giving me. And now you've made this personal." As Naomi stepped forward, there was a subtle shift in the cabin. The murmurs grew quieter, but there was an undeniable sense of anticipation in the air. The passengers were watching, and Angela realized, too late, that she had become the spectacle, not Naomi. Naomi turned toward the cockpit door, signaling that she was done with the exchange. She had no more words to say. Angela was the one who had failed to recognize her place in this situation. It wasn't Naomi who was out of line, it was Angela's assumptions, her prejudice, that had fueled the entire confrontation. The tension didn't dissipate immediately, but Naomi could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, and she knew, this moment would not be forgotten. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, who had ever been made to feel smaller than they were. Naomi had turned an ordinary flight into a moment of reckoning, not just for Angela, but for everyone watching. As Naomi returned to her seat, she knew the battle wasn't over. But what mattered now was that Angela's prejudice had been exposed, and the moment of truth had come. Naomi hadn't just defended her own dignity, she had set a precedent. And she knew that no matter how the rest of the flight played out, she had already won. Banda Noi. The flight continued, but the air in the cabin was different now. Naomi sat with an unwavering calm, her posture relaxed as she observed the growing discomfort around her. Angela had retreated to the back of the plane, no longer trying to engage, her earlier authority completely shattered. Naomi knew that her words, her silence, had exposed more than just Angela's behavior. They had highlighted the underlying prejudices that existed in the luxury of this space. She had shifted the narrative, and the plane felt different, like something had been awakened in the passengers. But Naomi wasn't done. She knew the confrontation wasn't over. The passengers who had silently witnessed the tension were beginning to ask themselves questions. Naomi's quiet strength had shaken the comfort of their expectations, and now, many of them were re-evaluating their assumptions about the situation. She could see it in their eyes, the way they were now glancing at her with more respect, a flicker of awareness beginning to shine through their initial disinterest. Naomi's mind was focused, her thoughts sharp. She had anticipated this moment, a moment of reckoning where the truth would have to rise to the surface. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed based on appearances. Every time someone had been judged or ignored because of who they were or what others assumed about them. Today, she wasn't just a passenger on a plane. She was an agent of change, and this moment, this confrontation, would not be forgotten. After a few moments of tense silence, Naomi noticed that a few passengers had begun to talk amongst themselves. There was an undercurrent of discomfort that hadn't been there before. Naomi could hear snippets of conversation, some whispering in disbelief, others voicing their admiration for the way she had handled the situation. A businessman seated nearby leaned toward her, offering a slight, respectful nod. She returned his gaze with a quiet smile, acknowledging the silent support. He'd been one of the first to question Angela's treatment of her, and though he didn't speak loudly, his silent backing had been felt. Then, the moment Naomi had been waiting for arrived. The cockpit door opened, and the pilot emerged, his face a mixture of anxiety and purpose. Naomi looked up at him as he approached. He seemed unsettled, but his eyes were fixed on her, the only passenger he had yet to address directly. The hum of the plane was louder now, filling the cabin with an almost ominous energy. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the impending shift. The pilot stopped at the front of Naomi's seat, his expression tight. He didn't wait for any formal greeting. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk. The situation has been brought to the attention of our management." Naomi didn't flinch. She sat back in her seat, her calm demeanor in full force as she met his gaze. "Go ahead," she said simply, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had already made up her mind. The tension in the air thickened, and Naomi could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin resting on her. "The management has been informed," the pilot continued, glancing nervously at the other passengers before turning his attention back to Naomi. "They've instructed me to ensure that this matter is handled properly. I'm afraid we'll need to make an unscheduled landing." The passengers' murmurs filled the air like a low rumble. Naomi's face remained unreadable, but she knew exactly what was happening. She had expected this. The moment had come for Angela to face the consequences of her actions, and Naomi was not about to let this moment pass without making sure that the right steps were taken. "I see," Naomi replied, her tone calm but resolute. "Then I suggest we make sure everything is handled appropriately." The pilot nodded, his expression faltering slightly. He took a step back, signaling to the flight attendants who had been hovering nearby. Naomi noticed that Grace, the younger flight attendant, was watching her closely. There was something in Grace's eyes now, something Naomi recognized, a shift in her understanding of the situation. She had watched everything unfold, her discomfort slowly giving way to respect for Naomi's resolve. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The plane's descent was smooth, but the atmosphere in the cabin had become charged with anticipation. Naomi sat still, her eyes now fixed out the window, watching the landscape below. The city skyline stretched out as the plane made its approach. It was strange to feel a sense of peace in such a tense moment, but Naomi had learned that moments of chaos often carried with them the potential for the greatest changes. She was determined to see this through to the end. Finally, the wheels of the plane touched down, the hum of the engines slowly easing into silence. The plane rolled smoothly along the runway, and passengers straightened in their seats, the low murmur of voices slowly returning. No one spoke loudly, but the weight of the moment was felt by everyone. A sleek black SUV waited on the tarmac, its gleaming surface reflecting the late afternoon sun. Two sharply dressed assistants stood by the vehicle, their movements swift and purposeful as they approached the plane. They didn't speak to the passengers, their attention solely focused on the woman inside the plane. Naomi could see them clearly as they made their way up the steps. Their confident strides left no room for doubt, they were here for Naomi. The door to the plane opened, and the assistants stepped inside. One of them spoke with respect, their voice calm but firm. "Miss Williams," he said, offering a slight bow, "everything is ready for your review." Naomi stood slowly, adjusting her blazer with the deliberate calm of someone who was used to commanding attention. She looked toward Angela, who was still standing near the galley, her face now pale with realization. Naomi took one last glance at her, the weight of her earlier actions still lingering. The once defiant flight attendant, so sure of herself just hours ago, was now visibly shaken. Naomi had known from the beginning that this moment would come. She had been patient, but patience wasn't the same as submission. Naomi walked toward the door, her steps measured and graceful, each movement radiating a quiet power that left no room for argument. As she passed Angela, Naomi offered no words. She didn't need to. Her presence alone spoke volumes. Outside, the world seemed to shift. The assistants opened the SUV door for Naomi, and she stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment lift slightly as the door closed behind her. The car began to move, and Naomi's thoughts returned to the mission ahead. This situation had unfolded far beyond what she had expected, but in a way, it had worked out as she had hoped. Not only had Angela been forced to confront her prejudices, but Naomi had also shown everyone aboard the plane that standing up for what was right was the only way forward. As the car sped off toward her next meeting, Naomi allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Today, she had not only defended her own dignity, but she had also taken a stand that would be remembered. She had exposed the injustice, and now, she was moving forward, empowered and undeterred. This was just the beginning of the ripple effect she had set into motion. The true victory wasn't in the momentary discomfort of one person, it was in the lasting change that would follow. The car moved smoothly through the city streets, Naomi's mind focused on the task at hand. The earlier moments in the plane were still fresh in her mind. She had done what needed to be done, confronted the prejudice that had been aimed at her, exposed it, and ensured that the wrongdoer would face the consequences. But now, as the sleek black SUV navigated through the traffic, Naomi knew that this was far from over. This was just the beginning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Naomi didn't need to check to know who it was. The number was familiar. The assistant in charge of the situation had just finished making arrangements for Naomi's next move. As soon as she pulled out her phone, the message flashed across her screen. Everything set. The press is waiting, and we're prepared to handle the fallout. Naomi allowed herself a small smile, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed a quick response. Good. Let's make sure this gets done properly. She couldn't shake the feeling that the ripple effect of her actions would be felt far beyond this day. The power of the internet, the speed with which information traveled, meant that this confrontation would not remain confined to the confines of this plane. The world would soon know what had happened, and Naomi was prepared for that. Her thoughts turned back to the flight. The passengers had watched with rapt attention as she handled Angela, the lead flight attendant. Naomi had known from the start that Angela would resist, that the moment would be tense and difficult. But she had also known that standing up to the condescending treatment, the prejudices that Angela had assumed about her, would send a powerful message. And now, as Naomi sat in the back of the SUV, she could feel that message echoing through every city, every home, and soon, every screen. People would hear it. People would listen. As the car continued down the road, Naomi thought about the aftermath. She'd heard the whispers of the passengers, those quiet exchanges that signaled their shifting perceptions. They'd seen how Angela had tried to exert control over Naomi, assuming that because she didn't fit the mold of what she thought a first-class passenger should look like, she had the right to treat her poorly. But Naomi had turned the tables. She'd done more than confront Angela, she'd exposed a deeper truth about the way people were treated based on their assumptions. The SUV came to a smooth stop outside a sleek high-rise building. The large glass doors shimmered in the light, and the hustle and bustle of the city seemed a world away. This was Naomi's world, the world she had worked tirelessly to build. She'd become more than just a successful businesswoman, she was now a symbol of strength, of someone who refused to let others define her. Two of Naomi's assistants stepped out first, their sharp suits signaling the urgency of the meeting ahead. They moved with purpose as Naomi exited the car, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. The building before her wasn't just an office, it was the nerve center of her growing empire. It was here that decisions were made, where people's futures were shaped, and where, Just hours ago, she had initiated the first step of a movement that would reshape perceptions of power and privilege. Inside, the mood was tense, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Naomi's arrival was met with hushed murmurs of respect. She nodded at the team members waiting for her. It was time to go to work. The press conference was scheduled to begin in mere minutes, and Naomi took a deep breath as she made her way into the conference room. The space was large, with walls adorned in minimalist artwork that reflected the elegance of her brand. The journalists gathered, their cameras trained on the door as Naomi entered. She stood at the center of the room, her posture straight, her confidence unwavering. The first question came quickly, the reporter's voice sharp and direct. "Miss Williams, can you tell us what motivated you to confront the flight attendant on your plane?" Naomi's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the reporters, some eager, others skeptical. She smiled, knowing that this moment would define how the world saw her from now on. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. "It wasn't about me. It was about the millions of people who are constantly judged, mistreated, and dismissed based on assumptions. What happened on that plane was a clear example of how prejudice can take root in the smallest of interactions. But I refuse to stand idly by while others are wronged, even in situations that seem trivial. If we let small acts of discrimination slide, they become normalized. And I won't allow that." The room fell silent for a moment as Naomi's words settled into the minds of the journalists. She could see the weight of her statement hitting them, sparking thoughts, stirring emotions. Another reporter, his voice tinged with doubt, spoke up. "But some might say that your response was too extreme. Calling attention to it in such a public manner could have escalated the situation. What would you say to that?" Naomi's eyes hardened slightly, but her tone remained calm and measured. "I believe the response was necessary. We're not talking about an isolated incident. This happens every day, in more subtle ways than people care to admit. If we only address the issues when they're at their peak, we're failing to address the deeper, systemic problems that cause them. My actions today were about making sure that this conversation is had, and it's one we can no longer ignore." As Naomi spoke, she could sense a shift in the room. What had started as skepticism was now giving way to admiration. The reporters were no longer just asking questions, they were listening, truly listening to the words she was saying. Naomi's leadership was becoming evident, not just in her business empire, but in her ability to command respect and to challenge societal norms. The questions continued, but Naomi answered them with the same poise, the same confidence that had served her throughout her career. She spoke not just as a businesswoman, but as a leader who had faced adversity and who now had the platform to make real change. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that Naomi was not just a powerful figure in the business world, she was a trailblazer, a voice for those who had been silenced by prejudice. The press conference ended, and Naomi stepped away from the podium, her eyes now clear, her resolve stronger than ever. As she made her way back to her office, she felt the weight of the day's events, but she also felt something else, hope. The ripples she had set in motion were beginning to spread, and she knew that this moment would be remembered for years to come. But Naomi wasn't done. She knew that change didn't come in one moment, one confrontation, or even one press conference. True change took time, and it required a sustained effort to challenge the status quo. As she entered her office, the reality of her mission began to sink in. There was so much more to do. The foundation had been laid, but the fight had only just begun. Naomi sat in her spacious office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city skyline. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden light across the room. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping on the desk as she reflected on the events of the past few days. The press conference had been a success, and the ripple effects of her actions were already being felt. People were talking. The story had gone viral, and with it, Naomi had garnered not just admiration, but a newfound sense of responsibility. The events on the plane had sparked a movement, one that would continue to gain momentum, but it wasn't just about that single incident. Naomi knew that change wasn't immediate, it was a slow, sometimes painful process. But with every step, every conversation, every policy she implemented, she was moving closer to her goal of creating a world where people, no matter their background or appearance, were treated with respect and dignity. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, and the message was from her assistant. The board meeting is in 30 minutes. We'll discuss the new initiatives, and the plans for expansion. You're ready, right? Naomi smiled to herself, her fingers already moving across the keyboard as she quickly replied. Of course. I'm looking forward to it. She set the phone down and stood up, adjusting her blazer as she walked toward the large mirror by the door. She had to look the part: confidence, composure, leadership. The board meeting wasn't just about numbers or strategy, it was about the vision. Naomi had always believed that true leadership was more than just steering a company toward profitability. It was about creating a legacy, one rooted in values that transcended the bottom line. As she made her way to the meeting room, her mind shifted to the future. The journey she had embarked on was far from over. She had set the wheels in motion to change not only her company's culture but also the broader industry. Her airline would be the model for respect and equality, and Naomi would ensure that no one would forget the lesson she had imparted. The boardroom was quiet as Naomi entered, the members already seated around the large polished table. They all stood as she walked in, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. Naomi had earned their trust over the years, but this meeting was going to be different. It wasn't just about the next quarter's performance, it was about shifting the direction of the company in a way that reflected the values she now held firmly at her core. Please, everyone, take a seat, Naomi said, her voice calm and commanding. She waited for them to settle before taking her own seat at the head of the table. Her posture was perfect, her gaze steady. She was ready. I'm sure you've all seen the press conference, Naomi began, her eyes sweeping across the room, making sure she had everyone's attention. And I'm sure you've seen the response on social media, the way people have reacted to what happened on that plane. The board members exchanged glances, but no one interrupted. Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. This company has always prided itself on providing luxury and comfort to our passengers. But what happened on that flight showed me something that we've overlooked. It's not just about the service we provide, it's about how we treat people, every person who steps foot on this plane. Our passengers deserve more than just a comfortable seat and fine dining. They deserve respect, no matter their background, their appearance, or their status. There was a brief silence as the board members processed her words. Naomi's leadership had always been about vision, but now, it was about something more, something deeper. She was creating a culture that valued human dignity above all else. I've made decisions in the past based on data and profit margins, she continued, her voice steady but passionate. But this time, I'm making decisions based on something far more important: doing what's right. And as of today, we are implementing a new set of policies across this airline. Every passenger will be treated with the respect they deserve, no exceptions. The room was quiet, but Naomi could feel the weight of the moment. The board members knew that Naomi wasn't just speaking from a place of moral righteousness, she was speaking from a place of deep conviction. Her company, her legacy, would reflect this commitment to equality and respect. We will no longer tolerate discriminatory behavior, whether from staff or passengers, Naomi stated firmly. We will ensure that every person, regardless of their appearance, background, or status, feels like they belong. It's time for a change. And I'm leading it. A murmur of agreement passed through the room, but Naomi could tell that not all of them were on board. There would always be resistance, especially when it came to entrenched power structures. But Naomi was prepared for that. She had always been prepared to challenge the status quo, to fight for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. I know this may seem like a drastic shift, she continued, but it's a necessary one. We will be implementing extensive training for all our staff, from flight attendants to ground crew, to ensure that everyone understands the new standard. We will also be establishing a zero-tolerance policy for any form of bias or discrimination. One of the board members, a seasoned executive named Richard, spoke up. Naomi, this is a bold move. But it's going to take time. Changing the culture of an entire company, especially one as established as ours, isn't something that happens overnight. Naomi nodded, her gaze unwavering. I'm not expecting overnight results. But I'm expecting progress. And I'm willing to put in the work to make that happen. This company, this airline, will be the model for what's possible when you lead with integrity and respect. Richard nodded, though his expression was still wary. I'll admit, I'm on board with the idea. But we need to consider the potential backlash, the costs involved. There will be some who resist, and there will be some who won't like this new direction. Naomi's eyes flashed with determination. I understand that, Richard. But the cost of doing nothing is far greater. We have a responsibility, not just to our passengers, but to the world. It's time we take a stand. The room fell silent once more as Naomi's words hung in the air. She had always known that leading a company was about more than just profits. It was about leaving a legacy that would inspire change and influence the world for the better. We're going to do this, Naomi said finally, her voice resolute. And I expect all of you to lead by example. As the meeting continued, Naomi's thoughts began to shift once again. She had set the wheels of change in motion, but the true work was just beginning. She wasn't just building an empire, she was shaping a future where respect, equality, and integrity were the foundation of everything she did. When the meeting was over, Naomi walked back to her office, her mind already racing ahead to the next challenge. She knew that change would come, but it would require persistence, patience, and the unwavering commitment to doing what was right. She was ready for it. As she sat at her desk, looking out at the city below, Naomi smiled to herself. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be worth it. The future was bright, and she was leading the way. Naomi Williams stood by the window of her penthouse suite, gazing out over the city skyline. The events of the past few weeks had propelled her into the spotlight, and the journey she had started was no longer just about her personal mission, it had become a movement. Her actions on the plane, the swift and decisive changes she had implemented within her airline, were just the beginning. The ripples of her decision to stand up for respect and equality were beginning to touch every corner of the industry, and Naomi had no intention of slowing down. The phone on her desk buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant, Luke. The media interview is scheduled for 3 p.m. Don't forget the press release on your new initiative will go live at the same time. Naomi smiled faintly. This was just another step in her plan, another platform to amplify the message that respect and integrity should be the foundation of all industries. With each passing day, she felt more and more connected to the broader impact she was making. She had set out to challenge the system, but now it seemed like she was on the cusp of changing it. She walked to her desk and took a seat, her fingers brushing across the sleek surface. Her gaze lingered on the framed picture of her parents that sat on the corner. They had always instilled in her the value of standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. It was that foundation that had led her to this moment. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed or marginalized because of their appearance or background. As the hour approached for the interview, Naomi made her way to the studio. She was ready, her appearance impeccable, her posture straight, and her resolve firm. She had faced obstacles before, but this moment felt different. There was a quiet power within her now, one that wasn't about asserting dominance, but about asserting the truth. She had seen the impact of her actions. Now, it was time to take that message further. The studio was bustling with activity when she arrived, the crew members rushing around to prepare for the live broadcast. Naomi's publicist was waiting for her, her smile warm but with a hint of nervousness. "Naomi, you're going to do great," the publicist said. "We've already received tons of messages from people who've been moved by your story. Just be yourself." Naomi nodded, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about telling her story, it was about sparking a larger conversation. A conversation that was long overdue. As the interview began, Naomi sat confidently across from the host, a well-known television personality with a reputation for asking tough questions. She could sense the weight of the moment, but she had prepared for it. Her response to every question was thoughtful, measured, and full of conviction. When the host asked about the incident on the plane, Naomi's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "Respect is not something that should be earned based on your appearance or your status," Naomi explained. "It's something that should be inherent. We live in a world where people are too often judged before they even speak, simply based on how they look or where they come from. What happened on that flight was a direct reflection of how systemic prejudices still affect every aspect of our lives. My goal is to challenge that, to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity." The host nodded, clearly impressed with Naomi's poise. "And you've taken concrete steps to ensure that your airline is a model of equality. Can you tell us more about the policies you've implemented?" Naomi smiled slightly, her pride for the changes she had set in motion evident. "We've made changes to our hiring practices, ensuring that we're not only looking at people's qualifications, but also at their character. We're implementing training for all staff members to combat unconscious biases. And we've created a new policy for passengers. Everyone who steps onto one of our planes will know that they will be treated equally, no matter their appearance, their background, or their financial status." The host leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "And what has the response been so far?" "The response has been overwhelmingly positive," Naomi replied. "There are, of course, those who resist change. Change is hard, and not everyone is ready for it. But I've seen firsthand the difference it makes when people are given the space to thrive, when they are treated with respect. That's what we're trying to create, an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed." As the interview continued, Naomi felt the energy in the room shift. The message she was spreading wasn't just about policy or corporate responsibility, it was about values. And those values were resonating with people on a deeper level than she had anticipated. Later that evening, Naomi returned to her penthouse, the glow of the city lights casting a soft hue across the room. She took a moment to reflect on the day. The interview had gone well, but it was the conversations that followed that she had been anticipating. The emails, the messages on social media, the calls from industry leaders, everyone wanted to be a part of the change she was creating. But as the success of her campaign continued to grow, Naomi knew that she couldn't stop there. The ripple effect she had started was only the beginning. She wanted to see this shift spread across the world, to challenge and dismantle the systems of inequality that had been in place for far too long. She stood up and walked over to the window, her gaze sweeping across the city. There was so much more work to be done. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But she was ready. The next phase of her plan was already in motion. Naomi had been in discussions with several organizations dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in other industries. She had already started laying the groundwork for partnerships that would help her further her mission of creating spaces where respect and fairness were guaranteed, not just in the travel industry, but in every field. Her vision had never been clearer. She wasn't just leading an airline, she was leading a movement, one that would shape the future in ways that no one could have predicted. And as Naomi stood by the window, watching the world unfold below her, she smiled to herself. The journey was far from over, but she knew this. The world was changing, and she was at the forefront of that change. With each step she took, she was laying the foundation for a future where respect wasn't a luxury, it was a standard. And Naomi Williams was determined to ensure that everyone, everywhere, would have the opportunity to experience it. Naomi Williams sat in her office, reviewing the reports that had flooded in from various departments since the public announcement of her new policies. She had expected some pushback. Reform, after all, was never easy, but the extent of resistance within her company had taken her by surprise. Some of the more long-standing employees seemed unwilling to embrace the cultural shift she was driving. Naomi could feel the weight of the challenge ahead of her. She wasn't simply changing the way people viewed respect in her airline, she was changing the very fabric of the company itself. She leaned back in her chair, the soft leather creaking under her. The day had been long, filled with meetings, interviews, and phone calls, all demanding her attention. But the most pressing issue remained: how to navigate the resistance from within her own ranks. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from her assistant, Luke, appeared on the screen. The board meeting is in 30 minutes. They're expecting you to address the internal concerns. Naomi sighed deeply. She had anticipated this moment, the moment when her company's leadership would demand justification for the changes she had made. They weren't simply questioning the policies themselves, they were questioning her ability to lead the charge. As she stared at the message, Naomi thought about the people who had been with the company for years, people who had built it into the success it was. They had seen how things worked before her arrival, and now they were being asked to change everything they knew. But Naomi wasn't afraid of a challenge. She had built an empire on the back of doing things differently, and this was no different. She straightened her blazer, took a deep breath, and walked out of her office, ready to face the board. The boardroom was silent when she entered, the faces of the executives hard to read. The room was filled with the usual polished figures, people who had spent decades in navigating the delicate dance of corporate politics. But today, they were not the ones in control. Naomi could sense the tension in the air as she took her seat at the head of the table. "Naomi," said Frank, the CFO, breaking the silence. "We've had several discussions regarding the recent changes. While the public reaction has been mostly positive, we're seeing increasing unrest among some of our senior staff. These changes are drastic, and we're not sure if we're fully prepared for them. Naomi listened, her face impassive, as Frank continued. The truth is, respect and inclusivity are important, but they need to be balanced with efficiency. We've always prided ourselves on our business acumen, and now we're concerned that we might be shifting too much focus to the culture side without enough consideration for our bottom line. Naomi's mind raced as she absorbed the implications of Frank's words. She had anticipated concerns about the financial impact of her policies, but hearing it directly from her CFO stung. She had spent years building her reputation as a shrewd businesswoman, someone who understood the balance between growth and compassion. It was clear that her board did not yet share her vision. "I understand your concerns," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "But let me be clear. These changes are not just about inclusivity, they are about creating a sustainable future for this company. We cannot continue to thrive in a world that's rapidly changing by holding on to outdated ideas of success. It's not just about the bottom line, it's about creating a culture that will foster loyalty and trust from both our employees and our customers." Frank's expression hardened, but Naomi didn't flinch. She continued. "I've already seen the results. Our employee satisfaction scores have increased by 30% since we began implementing these policies. And the public is responding positively. People want to support companies that align with their values, not just companies that are profitable. I'm not asking you to ignore the business side of things. I'm asking you to trust that these changes will make us more profitable in the long term by fostering an environment of mutual respect." The room was quiet as the board members exchanged glances. Naomi could sense that they were not entirely convinced, but she had expected this. She had prepared for this moment for months, studying the challenges and anticipating the objections. She knew that convincing them would not happen overnight, but she had faith that her vision would ultimately prove successful. "I know these changes aren't easy," Naomi continued. "But we can't keep doing things the way we always have. The world is changing, and so must we. We need to be a company that leads by example. If we can create a workplace that treats every person with dignity, we'll not only be known as a leader in the industry, we'll be known as a company that changed the game." She paused, letting her words settle into the room. She could see some of the executives beginning to soften. She had gotten through to them, just a little. But there was more to do. After a long silence, Amanda, the head of HR, spoke up. "I'm not going to lie, this has been a difficult transition," Amanda said, her voice low but thoughtful. "But I can see where you're coming from, Naomi. We've already started seeing some positive changes within our workforce. The younger generation is particularly responsive to the new policies. They're not just looking for a paycheck, they want purpose. And the truth is, we can't afford to lose that demographic." Naomi nodded, grateful for Amanda's support. "Exactly," she said. "This isn't just about a shift in policy. It's about changing the way we view the workplace. If we treat our employees with respect, they'll return that respect tenfold. And our customers will see that in every interaction they have with us." The rest of the meeting went on, and by the end, Naomi could sense that the board was beginning to come around. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was progress. She had made her case, and now it was time to let her actions speak louder than her words. As she walked out of the boardroom, Naomi's mind was already moving to the next challenge. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more resistance, more hurdles to overcome. But she was ready. The shift in her company had begun, and she was determined to see it through. She had started this journey with the belief that respect was a fundamental right, not a privilege. She had built her reputation on that principle, and now she was ready to see the world change around her. As Naomi stepped out into the crisp evening air, she knew one thing for sure: she was just getting started. The path ahead was long, but with each step, she was closer to her goal. A future where respect and equality weren't just ideals, they were the standard. And she would make sure of it.